Welcome to Public Comment. I'm John Dunbar, former mayor of Yountville.
And I'm Alfredo Pedroza, former Napa County supervisor.
Today we're going to talk about politics, people, and whatever else is on our mind.
They claim that it's not about the clicks, it's not about the economics. Bullshit.
What do people want to read? Scandal,
They
tragedy.
already had the story made up, so they can monetize that headline.
Those aren't necessarily the most important things. It's just the ones they know are going to catch people's attention. Alfredo, what are we going to talk about today?
Well, John, I think we should talk about the media, social media, but also the challenges of governing in an era where the information, era is right in front of us.
It is interesting because when I started back in 2010 as mayor, but
I thought it was a
18
long time ago, by the way.
It was a long time ago. I think you were in middle school, maybe.
Let's not put references, but
There was a very different dynamic with news coverage, news in general, the way people were hearing about what was happening in their communities. And now we are faced with so many different options for learning things. Unfortunately, they're not always accurate. They're not always true.
well, I think it's a consumption of information, right? That people want instant, information, and we're putting aside accuracy, right? Because people want to be the first to report it, and we dealt with it during the emergencies, right? But to me, I really have an axe to grind with the monetization of the media. As someone that's been on the front page, right? And I would push back on some of these newspapers because they claim that it's not about the clicks, it's not about the economics. Bullshit. It is. And I get it, it's a business. But then don't say it's journalistic integrity when you know you're trying to run a business model to make money to sell papers. And that's the problem with the media, right? Whether it's at the national level or at the local level, there is a monetization of it that does drive decisions for media. And that is creating an influence in terms of what they're reporting.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a distinction between news media and social media. And unfortunately, social media is so available that everybody is now a reporter and a photographer and an influencer. But I know what you're talking about is really more about the professional news and how it's being not only monetized, but it's being challenged for its integrity and its accuracy because of the need to be immediate first. You have to be breaking news. Everything. I mean, when I watch the morning news, literally every story is breaking news. How can that be?
Well, look, I think one thing is wanting to be first. And I think another part is acknowledging the economic pressures of running a business. And if we think that news is not a business enterprise, we're kidding ourselves. Whether it's ABC or a local paper, there's a business component to it. The fact is, when you put certain things on the headline, when you cover certain people, it sells because they measure clicks, which means more views, which means they take that to advertisers so they can make more money. Simple as that. Black and white. It's not freaking gray. It's that simple. Now, we got to know that as a consumer. I don't fault them for running a business. They're doing what they have to do. Whether you're the editor of a local paper or the CEO of a national media company, you have a job to do. So they're doing their job. The issue I have is don't preach something that you know you're not doing. That you're not hiding behind a paywall, right? You're trying to sell papers so you can justify it to your bigwigs of what you're doing. Create circulation and sell advertisement. That's one element, right? And we can spend a lot of time on that. The other part is social media, right? And we dealt with this during the fires when people were trying to report that there's break-ins in certain neighborhoods, and it was false. And then we're trying to respond to it. And I think we're trying to adapt as a community, as a society. How do we learn to live in an era where information is so readily available, but the accuracy is not always there?
Well, I'm not sure you even know this about me in my very early days. So probably when you were in elementary school, if not younger than that,
I'm not gonna.
I was a reporter, and for 3 years,
I never would have guessed.
up in South Lake Tahoe, I worked for a local newspaper.
I'm going to drink to that.
Yeah, I'll drink to that too. Right on.
Being a reporter.
Right.
I'm sorry.
But yeah, I'm sure it sounds great to hear us drinking on our podcast. But the most important thing was to have both sides of a story, even if it meant you didn't break the news. You had to be fair, balanced, with integrity, and it all had to be relevant to the story you were telling. And it's been that way for a very long time. it still is that way in some cases. But too often it is about getting eyeballs on your websites. And what do people want to read? They want to read scandal. They want to read tragedy. They want to read things that, frankly, make them feel better about their own lives, that they're not as screwed up as somebody else, which is kind of a sad way to be. But people aren't caring about accuracy or integrity like they used to. Many of our media outlets still live by that, but not all.
Well, look, I think we got to bifurcate it because one is the print, right? The historic media, whether it's national politics or local politics. I think we just got to set the record straight. There is absolutely an influence on the message they create. And to say that it's about journalistic integrity, bullshit. I'm sorry, it's not, right? They have a job to do and they're doing their job. And it's monetizing it, it's creating revenue to fund the operation. How do we think those reporters are getting paid? It's not a nonprofit organization. Let's just be honest. It's a for-profit enterprise creating a message. And if you don't think there's owners or there's editors that are putting their own thumb on the scale, I'm sorry, it's happening. And we've seen it. You and I have been in Napa for a long time where we've seen editors come and go, and we've seen the tone of the paper come and go as well, right? So I think we just have to say that now. This is not about picking a fight, with them because they can cover our podcast and we've actually ignored some of the requests, or at least I have, right? It's not about that. It's just about creating transparency around the model of news coverage and how it influences certain ways of how a community can feel around it, right? And it's provoking emotion and in a response. And to your point, when you mentioned your story, which I didn't know you were a news reporter, I knew other things about you, which I'm not going to say, but you had a commitment to cover all sides because that was why you got into the business. It wasn't about writing a story that got you more clicks, that made you a headline reporter, for a national company. You had a job to do, which is tell a story. I don't think that's what people are doing anymore.
Yeah, and I think that there's a major influence by the ownership of news organizations it's just a different landscape today than it used to be.
Yeah.
And I don't typically like to, oh, it was better back then. I'm not that kind of person. I welcome
It was better back then.
But I welcome the evolution of everything, including how we get our news. The problem is you now have, in so many cases, national corporations that are looking purely at the bottom line. And where's the revenue coming from? It's coming from those salacious stories. It's not coming from the feel-good stories. Those are boring, right? People don't want to read about how happy people are. They want to read about tragedy and they want to read about trouble. And that's unfortunate. It's different. I think most reporters and editors are committed to truth and honesty. I don't see that always.
I disagree. I'm sorry. I disagree. Maybe I'm jaded.
But in our local coverage, I used to believe that was the case. I'm seeing times when that does not appear to be the case anymore, that there does seem to be bias against either individuals or topics that aren't making enough money and getting enough views.
And you and I know this, right? Because you can be a reporter. A reporter doesn't get to pick their headline, right? And if this was about journalistic integrity, the reporter who's writing the story would tend to choose what headline they wanted, but it's an editor. And why is an editor that's not writing that story choosing the headline? Because they're thinking about different lenses, they're thinking about different pressure points. And they might be thinking about what can I say that gets more clicks, that gets more views? And then if I get that, I'm going to go to that advertiser, to that business and say, look how many people are looking at my paper. You're monetizing that. Let's just call it a spade a spade. Now, again, we can't fault them for that, John, because they have a job to do. But own it and say it, and don't say that it's not happening. The issue that is separate and apart from that is what people consume. And that's a separate podcast around emotion and whether people like positive or negative stories, right? I happen to think when you do good, I'm happy for you. When you decided to get married, I was fucking happy for you, right? Because I care about you as a person and your wife. And that's good, right? And I think that's separate in terms of societal views and where we're at. Now, shifting gears a little bit, I think social media completely is changing the game. it's changing the game in terms of how the normal press is responding of wanting to be first. But to your point, what you said earlier, everyone wants to be a reporter. Everyone wants to say something on social media. And I've used social media to build my brand, right? Of being out there and telling people what you're doing. And people sometimes get caught up in it. And I think it's really influenced how people respond to things and what people perceive. And I think it's changing how messages get shared and how people react to that.
I think it's really telling at the national level about the struggle to have honest news. And I'm not the conspiracy theorist that was with some people in the national campaigns where, fake news. I don't buy that bullshit about fake news and that news organizations are explicitly trying to tip the scale. Um, some are 100%,
I was going to disagree with you, so I'm glad you said that.
but it used to be local news providers were immune from that. That it was true community news that we all have said that we wanted to help preserve. But we're seeing that um, trend of taking positions that uh, might distort the truth, but they get more interest. And it's unfortunate to start to see that happen. And it's happening because you now see our local news organizations posting on social media the stories because apparently they don't feel like they're getting enough views on their own websites.
Well, that's just sad. But going back to what you said about the news, how many times when you and I were in office, as we were making comments and you saw the press there, let's be honest, I would think about like, how are they going to quote what I'm saying? Right. So it influenced it because the power they had of misquoting you, of misrepresenting a statement of what they said and using it in a way that was salacious. And there were times as I was making, comments or decisions that I was mindful of how they could get me. And I think imagine that at a local level, you put that at a state level, you put that at a federal level, it multiplies. And you and I have seen examples where there's a clip taken out of context, the media runs with it, they sponsor it, and then it takes off. And then it's upon you and I to go look at the full clip. And then you say, God damn it. It's actually not the clip of how they tried to portray that. It was a completely different statement. And to me, that's where the integrity is lost, right?
You just reminded me of a recent occurrence where there was a totally one-sided bullshit account of a local story that was run by a local news organization that paid to place that story at the top of the list. And it not only that was the one that really got me angry about where's the other side to what this accusation is. And there wasn't another side because it was taking somebody's, I'll say, misrepresentation. I'll try to be nice about it and present it as fact. What happened to the journalistic reporting, investigation of is this true or not? So are we now just printing up opinion pieces and
Yes.
calling them news? Because that's what I'm seeing.
You're going to be fired up now, right? Because there's some reporters that are not writing for local papers, for regional papers, and then they shit on us, and I mean our community all the time, because they know by calling out Napa, they can get more clicks, and then they live here. And that's the problem, right? That is so intentional of what people are doing about calling Napa adult Disneyland so they can monetize that headline and show that they authored an article that got clicks. Again, I don't have an issue with the premise of what they're doing, but then own it and say it and be completely, fully transparent around what you're doing. And that's not what's happening, right? They're hiding behind, we're putting this information out there, not telling the complete story. And I know what story you're talking about, right? Where it was a reporter fishing to tell a story. They already had the story made up. They were just trying to get certain tidbits of information so they can complete the story when there was no story to tell. They just wanted to tell it because maybe they have connections to Napa people, right? And that's bullshit. And we got to call it out.
Yeah, and it's tough because, having been an editor and a reporter and learning firsthand way back in the day, this is like 40 years ago. So yeah,
Probably
it was
longer.
before you. You don't pick a fight with somebody who
Well, we,
buys ink by the barrel,
well, we
right?
are.
And the old, well, nobody's buying ink anymore. That's the thing. But uh, I can't believe when news organizations are sponsoring placement of their ads because they have to, apparently, because they haven't had enough views to legitimize the story. Maybe because the story's fucked in the very beginning. And maybe it shouldn't be told because you're attacking people and not giving them a chance to defend themselves. Yes, I'm a little raw about it because I went through that for a full year when I was running for mayor. And I was being attacked by a local tabloid that thankfully doesn't exist anymore, by a complete asshole who came in, thought he was hot shit, and made all kinds of accusations publicly about me. And then when I kicked his ass in the election, he disappeared and he went on to Washington and became a radical where he belongs, I guess. But, it's personal because we put our lives out there
Yeah.
and we make commitments to serve our community. And then people take shots at us. And then when we see others that aren't as dedicated to serving their entire community, it's like, why? Where's the equal treatment?
I like this,
I
John.
think I need to drink to
I
that.
like this, John, that I'm
Yeah.
seeing right now. Fiery, edgy. I like that. Keep going, man. But I know what it means, right? Because we all have those stories. And I think there is a space for media, there is a space for news, right? And I hope they understand they have a job to do. But the way they're doing it is wrong. And you and I, we got no skin in the game. Whether they write about this or not, we don't give a shit, to be honest, right? But I do think they have to acknowledge you can't get away with the same model that you've had before. And they got to be called out. And the public should know. And I hope that what I hope we accomplish today in this podcast is that people are getting a lens of how it truly works. And you don't have to take our word for it. Ask the question. Ask how they're measured. Ask how they make money. And you'll quickly realize that what we're saying, it's fucking true.
Well, people don't really appreciate the subtlety of how news is presented these days. We've learned bad habits from Facebook. See, and the next thing there's going to be a bolt of lightning, I think, come down. But
To be fair,
was that your Citizen of the Year award?
Well, no, I've never gotten one, but I actually hung that myself, so it's totally appropriate that it
So I'm
fell.
glad you're not doing any construction. But you look at, we all are obsessed with our phones, right? So you look at Facebook posts, or whatever posts they are from any news agency. We believe that must be the most important news of the day because it says so right here on my phone. It's news. So
Yeah.
I've got to believe whatever it says here. And we're seeing more and more of that at the local level too, where what are the so-called local stories
Yeah.
that are at the top of the website? And those aren't necessarily the most important things. It's just the ones they know are going to catch people's attention.
Look, you're talking about the attention side, and I've gone through some things that have really given me a different perspective on how I look at social media. And I was someone that posted quite often, right? Because I felt compelled to it. It was part of the brand, it was part of telling people what you do. And I took a step back from social media. And I'll tell you, it's actually pretty refreshing. And I never understood, when you would read about athletes when, they're not looking at social media because they're always getting trolled or things like that. And I'm not comparing it to that, but I never understood what it was like to disconnect from social media. And I do believe it's an incredible tool to look at engagement and how you can connect with people. I always saw it as that. But when you start reading comments and it starts impacting how you behave, how you respond, I think that's where it's crossed the line into a negative impact, a negative return. And I just hope that whether you're a kid looking at it, whether you get a like or two or 10 or 20, doesn't fucking matter. It's not your value. And whether someone puts something out there, don't accept it as a truth. There's still critical thinking that needs to happen. But sometimes it impacts us, right? It impacted you and I when we did things. And it impacts how people govern sometimes. And you can't govern based off a popularity contest on social media. You can't govern based off whether the press writes you the right way or not. lead the right way, do the things you have to do. And the media is going to have to, at a certain point, change their approach to, right? Because they can't keep getting away. The way they cover national politics, I think in this election, there's some exposure because people started calling it out. And I think you and I are doing that at a local level because before they were somewhat immune to it. You didn't see it impact locally. But I have personal stories. Some of our friends have personal stories of how the media wasn't fair. The media had one goal, and it was to sell papers and get clicks in spite of the facts. And people need to know that's what happens, right? You do what you want. We're not here to shape your opinion, right? We're just here to tell the truth. So that way, you as the consumer of that message, you know what it's like. But don't take it hook, line, and sinker because what they're telling you, there's a lean to it and they're putting their thumb on the scale. And I do believe that's happening.
And there isn't a filter on social media like there is, at least to a degree, with the professional news media. Social media, people should not believe everything they read on social media, please,
Yeah.
because there's no,
Or next door, which you love.
but even the other media platforms, social platforms, that anybody can post anything. I mean, you talked about during disasters. I remember during the 2017 fires that there were local residents, while we were all scrambling around doing what we could to have the emergency response, local resident, oh, I heard this burned
Oh,
down.
I know.
Oh, you must have, people were saying, you should evacuate. Shut up.
Yeah.
You're scaring people
Yeah.
just so you can post on social media and make it look like you're relevant. Stop it.
Well, that happened during the pandemic, right? So there's plenty of examples. But sometimes as electeds, we also saw it as an opportunity to build their brand, right? To say, look at what we're doing, selfie, with a house burning down, not knowing who that house belonged to, right? So I think there's a fine balance between using social media as a constructive communication tool versus using it to build your brand versus using it to misinform people. And I think it's all happening. But I do think it goes back to we're living in an era where information is moving so quickly. And I think as human beings, we haven't adapted to what that means. And I think there has to be a way where we learn to digest. And I'm someone that believes in small government and less regulation is better. But there might be something where we have to find a way to regulate, media in a different way because it's become weaponized. And you and I say that term a lot, but it has. And it makes it harder for people to do their jobs, whether you're that police officer trying to respond to a looting claim that's not true during an emergency or a firefighter trying to respond to a home that's burned that hasn't. It does impact the way government provides services or the pandemic. So I think the point of today is don't believe everything you read. Understand that there's some economics behind the traditional media and just think critically about what you read and make your own decision. As a human being, take it all in and make your own decision. I think that's the best thing I can say. And that's how it was kind of back in the day. And it's rare that we get kind of fun, sentimental about the old days. But I think there was some purity around those old days where it was a more pure message. And I think we just got to go back to that a little bit.
I want to make it very clear. I respect many of our local news personnel, photographers, reporters, editors. Not all. I believe some have been influenced and are motivated by things less than total authenticity and credibility, and that's disappointing. Social media is a disaster for information. Yes, it is a great platform to get information out, but is it really worth that for the negative side of people misrepresenting the truth, either intentionally or unintentionally? The worst of it is during crisis.
Yeah.
And I wish people would maybe one last time before you hit send, read what you just wrote and think about if you were in a position to read that, not knowing what was going on, would that help you or would that hurt you? Because being the first person on your block to write about something doesn't necessarily make you look good.
But we're dealing with humans and people, John, and that's just hard to change. I think all we can do is just provide information. And I think you're right of telling people think before you hit the send button. But that's human nature, right? I think for me, I look at these pillars of society, and the media is one of those pillars, right? We need an informed citizenry to live well and to have a good community. But I think we've lost our way, and we just have, and I'm a business person, right? I love business, but own what you are. And I think our media, you know, industry needs to be a little bit more forthcoming of how they operate and let the consumers decide. But to hide behind this veil of integrity and journalism, it's changed and they're not willing to own it and say it. So for anyone that's listening to our podcast, I just hope you understand a little bit more of how it works. And maybe you already knew. And if you did, phenomenal. But if you don't, I hope you take that away and just you're a little bit more informed. And that to me is a better outcome for our community in Napa.
It's easy for the general public to take shots at elected officials because there's no accountability for that. But as you can tell by me getting fired up today, just thinking, because I haven't thought about it for a long time, but it's still a real thing that happened and has shaped my thinking in my life. You've had things that happen that have shaped your life. We're people too. And just because we sit at the dais and respect our job as electeds doesn't mean that it doesn't impact us on a very personal level. So I'm fine with showing a little bit more emotion about the consequences of people's behavior. I hope they think about it before they keep clicking. And maybe if they stopped reading the bullshit stories, they wouldn't be the ones at the top of the website.
I want a cigar. Let's go to the porch.
I can toast to that.
Cheers.
Cheers.
All right, John, now that I have my cigar, I'm in my element. And look, today's discussion around news and media, it's a hard one. And I hope people understand that I'm not picking on them. I'm not saying there's no role for news and newspapers or social media. There is a role. But I think what we have to question is the integrity and the intentions of it, and know that people think critically of what that is. Because there are people putting their thumb on the scale, and that's all. You just have to understand that, so that way as you receive that message, you're interpreting it, you're putting it in your blender of values, and you receive a message that's more pure than what they're writing.
Well, and I also think it was important we distinguish between professional journalism and news and social media, because there is literally no filter in social media. And that's scary, because people can be naive into thinking whatever they read on the internet is truth. And that's not always the case.
I tell my kids to think critically. It's something I try to tell myself as well. And I just hope anyone that's tuning in, go back to the basics. Think critically. As you hear all this shit, you're the one that's receiving it. And that's it, right? So.
Well, I'm going to think critically right now and have a drink. Cheers.
Cheers.